Hello, I'm Dr. Sebrina Cook-Davis with Children's Home Society of North Carolina. Want to talk a little bit today about understanding your tween or teen's brain development. As you all know, teenage years are very difficult, sometimes challenging years for teenagers, and a lot of that is due to what is happening with their brain development. Brain growth and development continues all the way up until the early 20s actually. And so the brain is undergoing a rapid amount of change over the course of a child's life. And a lot of that change takes place for teenagers in what we call the prefrontal cortex. It is the very front part of the brain. It is the part of the brain that makes executive decisions. It's a computer part of the brain that looks at analyzing things and problem solving, and really that deep level of thinking that oftentimes surrounds decision making. And so I say all that as a disclaimer to start this off to say, be patient with your teenager and realize that their brains are actually not through growing yet. So they are at a critical moment where they are trying to sort of figure things out. They oftentimes parents say, I know I've taught them right from wrong. Why do they seem to be having struggles with that? Not so much that they are trying to be combative or rebellious all the time. It is actually that they do have a lot of brain development going on at that time. And they really are trying to build that part of the brain that helps them to make those executive decisions that will carry them through the long haul. And so for a parent, the biggest thing that we can look at during this time is how do we keep our teenagers safe? How do we nurture that brain development, recognizing that they are at a very critical stage in their development. Also important to note during this time that teenagers also have a shift in hormones. So you all know that they are going through a rapid amount of growth at that time, not only in their brain, but also physically. So they're going through a lot of changes in growing developmentally. You may be noticing changes with what they look like physically, but also how they're expressing themselves as well. So to note as well that hormones, neurotransmitters are also developing at that time. So at the time where we're seeing the executive part of the brain or the prefrontal cortex right here in the front growing, we also are seeing that the limbic system is in overdrive, and the limbic system controls a lot of our emotions. There's a little small organ there called the amygdala that sits in the limbic system that controls a lot of what we see with children and how they react and their emotions. And so oftentimes you will see a teenager that meets you with their emotional brain, but not necessarily meeting you with the thought processing, that prefrontal cortex. They're meeting you with the emotions. And so a lot of their decisions are based on just that. If it feels good, if it looks good, if it seems exciting, if it seems like it might be a challenge, even risky. Things like shoplifting or drinking or things that we typically would not want our teenagers to be engaged in, those types of activities, that risk-taking, that thrill-seeking behavior tends to be more increased during this time because of that very part of the brain. It's the part of the brain that does speak to emotion and that does speak to thrill-seeking. And so for a teenager in particular, it is a bit difficult to make those decisions because so much of their brain and the emotional side is overriding the side that says, you should not be doing that. So for parents, lots of talking about behaviors, lots of talking about a safety plan and helping them to make decisions during this time. I promise you this too shall pass. It takes time for the brain to grow and to develop. But what we can do during this time is to try to nurture children, to try to build a schedule, to try to build activities, sports, things that can keep them busy. Often one of the things you will see parents complain about all the time is their child complaining about being bored. And part of that, there again, has to do with the brain development. So the things that used to make a child excited, that they wanted to do when they were younger, when they hit those tween years or the teen years, you may see those activities start to decline. And it is because of what is going on in their brain. They are looking for new and creative things to do and to try and to be involved and engaged. And so as much as we can keep our children involved during this time in activities, that will help. It also helps to decrease their stress levels. So when children are, involved with activities that they want to be involved in that promote exercise and growth and learning and development, they are actually less likely to be involved in risky behaviors. So we don't want to over inundate, teenagers with that, but just to keep in mind that they do like to stay active and need to stay active in positive activities that will keep nurturing that brain development. We also want to monitor stress levels in teenagers. We do know that children do undergo stress just as adults do. The cortisol levels is actually produced, that is the hormone produced with stress, actually in high levels in children can cause some issues with brain development, and especially toxic stress. And so when we look at younger children in particular, we do want to make sure that we're monitoring levels of toxic stress. And the same thing applies for teenagers. They are undergoing a lot of change. They're going through a lot academically. They're trying to figure out what they're going to do with their lives as they move into this very important stage of adulthood. So we want to make sure that their stress levels are kept to a minimum. So nothing wrong with stress, because we know that we all experience it, but it needs to be at levels that are manageable, particularly for children who are having difficulties with being able to express their emotions all the time, which also leads to something that parents should also be aware of, that it has been also known that children during this stage often have issues with reading facial expressions. And so you may think that you are sending out some pretty strong messages to your teen with a stern face, with your, stance looking a bit stern. But actually, it is best to vocalize it. Oftentimes, teenagers do not read facial expressions the way you think they would. And so just to be clear, say what it is that you want to take place. Be very clear in how you communicate. It's very simple as saying, as a parent, you may say, don't run or stop that running. With a teenager, being clear and saying walk. Being very directive in what it is that you want your children to do. And this applies for younger children as well. So I would just say be very clear in what you're saying to teenagers. They need to have clear instructions. Also want to be open in talking to them and communicating with them. This does not start when they are teenagers. Hopefully, it is something that you will have been doing all along as a parent, and talking and nurturing and building up your child in that way. So they are more likely to come talk to you. The great news about all that we talk about with teenagers is that we know with overwhelming majority in support and research is that they want to hear about all things risky from you. So when we talk about sexuality, when we talk about having those very tough conversations with teenagers about drugs and alcohol and relationships and abuse and bullying, with overwhelming results, we've been able to see that teenagers really do want to hear those conversations come from their primary caregivers. And so we really encourage parents to ask yourself, are you an askable parent? Are you open? Are you willing to listen to what your children have to say? Because they have told us in numbers that they really do want to have those really tough conversations with us. So we have to prime ourselves, get ourselves ready to be able to have those conversations with them. I would also note with teenagers, understanding how they're sort of operating and moving right now, they need a lot of sleep. Teenagers don't just sleep for no reason. We think that they're just being lazy. They don't want to get up on a Saturday morning, and they seem to be dragging, and you're wondering what's taking them so long to get to moving. Well, the adolescent brain truly really does not kick in until about 10 o'clock a.m. So if your teenager is dragging, that is probably why. It is why we see a lot of children do best in early and middle college environments, because those schools open up later and it appeals to the adolescent brain. They actually kick in gear about 10 o'clock a.m. They also need about 10 hours of sleep. And oftentimes our teenagers are not getting that because of all the responsibilities and homework, and some may work and they have extracurricular activities. And so it is often difficult to ensure that our children are getting that 10 hours. So today, 10 and 10. So remember 10 and 10. So they need 10 hours of sleep, and their brains normally kick in about 10 o'clock a.m. So if you're really trying to get the optimal use of that teen brain, make sure they're getting some sleep, and also make sure that you are acknowledging that it may take them a while to kind of get going in the morning. So they're not, just being lazy and sort of dragging along. They really do have to, give themselves time to get to moving and get those brains to percolating. Also giving grace, and as I said earlier, that the brain fully, does not develop into the 20s. And so oftentimes we are having challenges with teenagers and thinking, what is going on with them? I know I've taught them what's happening. It's taking some time. It's going to take a little while for that brain to grow and to develop. And so continuing to have grace with that, and knowing that if you set up situations with your teenagers where you're trying to provide safety, you have open communication with them, you have built the building blocks for them for their brain development, that they will get to a place where they are making those good sound decisions that you would like for them to make. And they will not be perfect, as we were not perfect as adolescents, but we can certainly set up an environment where they are. We know that children who are in this adolescent period will cling to their peers. They will want to develop those interpersonal relationships, and they do become very important. That is a very important part of their development. But it certainly does not decrease the likelihood of what our importance will be to them. They do want to hear from adults. They need to have adults around them that they can trust, that they can talk to. We want to build assets in our children, both internal and external assets that will help them to be successful in adulthood. And so we know that nurturing that and surrounding them with people that you care, that you trust, whether it's at school or your faith community, that will continue to also help you during these trying times. Oftentimes during the teenage years, they are there to have somebody else to talk to. That's going to be very, very important. So do not dismay. It is part of development. We look at development like a roller coaster, and the teen years are certainly having you buckle up for the ride. But it's also a time of, I think, enlightenment. It's a time to connect with them. It's a time to help build and shape who they will be as adults. And so it's also very exciting. So be patient with your teens. Understand they're going through a lot of growth and a lot of development during this time. Make sure you are instituting your discipline methods. As we've said before, discipline is very important, but a lot of your discipline will be around communication. It will be talking to them, sitting down with them, and really getting to the nitty gritty of what might be going on with them, making sure you're knowing who they're with, their peers and their relationships that they're forming. All of that is so important during this time. So continue to grow with your teenagers. It is a great process. I have two of my own, and I know it's difficult, but it has been quite the journey. So hang in there. Utilize us if you need to, if you want to chit chat more about this growth and period of teenage adolescence. We are more than willing to support you. Visit our website at www.chsnc.org. Thank you. Be well and be safe.